It gives me a great pleasure to chair today's seminar presentation, The Art of Writing in the Rain, to be delivered by Professor Mark Mason. Some of you might have known that Professor Mark recently won the Humanities and Social Sciences prestigious fellowship scheme awarded by RGC. The scheme, introduced in the academic year of 2012 to 13, aims at granting extended time off and supporting funds to the outstanding investigators under the disciplines of the Humanities and Social Sciences panel to enable them to focus on research work and writing. So Mark is going to use the scheme to write a book. Today in his presentation, Professor Mark will, based on his years of experience as a writer and as an editor of numerous journals and book series, focus on the techniques of good academic writing. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Mark. Thank you.
Tina, thanks very much. Colleagues, thanks very much for coming. I think we have a good number of graduate students amongst us here as well. And so this presentation is really aimed at anybody who wants to improve their writing. And I've spent my whole life trying to improve mine. I was for a few years editor of the biggest journal in my field, the International Journal of Education Development, which meant I was seeing more than 500 manuscripts coming across my desk every year. And so there's a lot of dense stuff that hits you, and one learns to quickly recognize a skilled author from somebody who's not so skilled. And I learned that one really wants to try to impress a reviewer as quickly as you can. So it's kind of with that in mind that I'm offering this presentation. We have other very experienced editors amongst us. Liz Jackson is here with us, our head of department, also been heavily involved in this. And I know that Liz will probably echo everything I have to say here. And what I'm doing today is really kind of bearing my soul in a way to say, well, here's a piece of writing which I did. Let's feel free to pick it apart. And there are some points where I'm going to say to you, do you think I should have done this, or do you think I should have done that? I'm going to start with something that I've often shared with students, colleagues, since I first actually taught this at the University of Hong Kong in their graduate school. I was teaching this to PhD students back in 1999, I think, in the graduate school at the University of Hong Kong, and I've tried very hard since then to share this as widely as I can. All students in my classes get exposed to this. Because oddly enough, even though we're at university, we seem to spend not enough time helping our students learning how to write. Why this weird title, The Art of Writing in the Rain? Well, I suppose it got your attention. So in that way, it's a success. It's a play on a movie it's a kind of a family movie called The Art of Racing in the Rain, and it's about a golden retriever dog and his owner, who is a racing driver. And our family has a golden retriever, and it's a favorite family movie of ours. And if you read to the end of my bio, you would have seen that I've actually long been a very keen road bike rider, which does often involve the art of racing in the rain. So this was just to try to get your attention here. And what we're going to do today is look briefly at two key aspects of writing. Whether you're writing for a journal, you're preparing a book, you're writing a grant proposal, whatever you want to do, you're going to have to put together a good introduction, a good abstract. And then I'm going to look at how you might structure your writing a little more clearly by using what I call a purpose content rubric. And then I'm going to move from there and show you some text from my Humanities and Social Sciences prestigious fellowship proposal, and we'll kind of pick that apart. You should feel free to interrupt me at any time. Maybe that might be difficult. Okay. Yeah. Tina, will you keep an eye on any questions that come in through the chat. I'm going to sort of focus on this. Thank you. Many people tend to mistake an abstract for an introduction, and they submit to a journal or whatever a paragraph that actually looks like an introduction more than it looks like an abstract. And an abstract, in my view, should have 11 points in it. These are the 11. You need to identify the problem, the question that comes out of that, your particular thesis or proposal or claim that you're wanting to justify. And out of that, what are your aims and purposes? And then you sort of step back and say, all right, this is my research context or my theoretical paradigm or the literature in which I'm working. And from that, you'll build your premises or your assumptions. You're standing on the shoulders of other authors, other researchers in the field before you. Then, of course, you describe the method you're using, the results that come out of that, the conclusions that you draw from your results, and what are the outcomes and the significance of the paper. That most of us know, but not all of us manage to actually achieve that. I should immediately also, though, step back, because I've had colleagues at conferences where I've discussed this, particularly colleagues in continental philosophy in Europe, who tell me, if we start a paper with that analytic nonsense, we'll never get it published. So this is a very kind of, if you like, clear and analytically oriented way of suggesting that we start. But I have had some strong opposition from people that they don't believe this is a good thing at all. Others, yeah, I'll come to that in a moment. So I'm going to, in the following slide, share with you what an opening paragraph or abstract could look like. I'm going to use the first person, and I want to say something about that now, which I am going to say, well, which is marked for me to mention to you in my proposal. In my research proposal, I did use the first person. Disciplines like psychology try to avoid the first person as much as they can, because of course psychology is trying very hard and has always tried to be every bit as rigorous as physics or chemistry. And so the first person is often frowned on in those kinds of disciplines. Whereas I think since the sort of postmodern shifts, that we've stopped pretending to be scientifically wonderful, and that actually the first person is probably more appropriate. And I think it gives you much greater degrees of freedom if you're writing in the first person. So if it's appropriate, or yeah, if you can get away with it, I would suggest doing that. Okay, I've said at the bottom there that you write your abstract first and you write it last, because it's something that helps you to clarify your concerns. And of course, it's something that you polish at the end, because it's the first thing that's going to make an impression on your reviewer. Now, here's a strange thing which I show to all of my students. You just have to complete the dots. So it looks like a grade 7 exercise, but actually this is extraordinarily difficult. We are going to share this PowerPoint afterwards, so don't worry about trying to read everything or trying to take everything down. But there I've dealt with all 11 issues in a very oversimplified, complete the dots. And oddly enough, when I taught this for the first time in the graduate school at Hong Kong U, I had a PhD student come to me the next day, and she said, you know, Mark, I have been working on my PhD for 3 years, and last night I took this rubric of yours home and I fitted my ideas and concerns into this. And for the first time in 3 years, I actually understand what I'm doing in my PhD. And I wasn't too surprised to hear that. And a number of people have told me how helpful this is. At the bottom, I then suggest that you use what I call an XYZ sentence. Actually, it was my supervisor in my own doctoral thesis who taught me this. If you can write one sentence which says, in short, this study addresses the problem X by doing Y in order to achieve Z. If you can do that, basically it's the what, the how, and the why, you're halfway home. I think. It's not easy to do that. It's a really difficult thing. But if you can, I think you're well on your way. If you're writing a more substantial piece, like a monograph or a doctoral thesis, you could then take your next paragraph, say the previous screen was your abstract. This may then be worked into your introduction. The key point here is it covers the same ground, but it does it in a spiral way. So it's expanding spirally on what you've already laid down. It's not moving in a linear direction into new material. And I'll show you that in my proposal. So no need to read that. There's another way to start. And you see this in not journalism as in newspapers, but journalism as in feature articles. So when journalists have written a substantial article about an issue and they want to hook your attention quickly, they will start by painting for you a vignette, a small picture, a paragraph, which tells a story that you can recognize. And I'm going to read this briefly. Bent double in the rice paddy, Ma Yan stretched her aching back, raised her arm, and waved to her twin brother as he eagerly set off for school in the early morning mist. She smiled to him, happy for him that he at least could still revel in the wonders to be discovered at the feet of their teacher in the classroom in which they had both learned together, at least until last summer. And so she could not hide the sadness in her smile as she asked herself once again why it was that since last autumn's scrawny harvest, there was money enough to send her brother to school, but not her. Ma Yan's story is probably played out in every rural village in China. When the consequences of poverty strike deep, so does gender discrimination in education, as families exclude their daughters from school before they will keep their sons at home. A picture that everybody's familiar with, no matter what continent you come from. That will play out where boys will typically be sent to school when there's not enough money in the family, and girls will be kept at home. So I'm introducing these key issues of gender, poverty, etc. in international education development just by hooking you in with a paragraph that you can recognize, you can identify with. If not personally, at least you know that story. In the bottom sentence on that slide, I've said that this is an inductive technique. What do I mean by that? Simply that you're writing upwards. Induction works in the opposite direction to deduction. Deductive reasoning goes downwards, as you know, from general principles, axioms, downwards into particular conclusions. Think of your Euclidean geometry at school, which is our sort of best experience of deductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning works upwards from familiarity with particular examples into generalization of principles. Well, this is a style of writing that you could call inductive because it's going upwards into the theory from an example with which your reader is familiar. I don't know if you're going to get that approved by the journal to which you're submitting. You need to think about that. Perhaps your abstract can be formal and analytically structured, as I suggested earlier, but perhaps your first paragraph could start like that to draw the reader in. What I do when I supervise my doctoral students is I really hold their hand very closely at the beginning. I'm almost like a school mom that I won't let them go. They have to see me often. They have to get that abstract right. And then once they've got the abstract right and the XYZ sentence right, I then ask them to go away and to prepare a complete outline of what they think the whole dissertation is going to look like. A chapter, section, subsection outline, showing the heading of each section and subsection as far as they can at that stage. The point I'm making here, though, is that I ask them then to write under each section heading and each subsection heading, under that to write 2 sentences. The purpose of this chapter or section or subsection is the following. It therefore contains the following content which serves that purpose. And the point of this is to let your writing be driven by purpose. Every chapter, as you know, in a dissertation, serves a particular purpose, whether it's your methodology chapter, your literature review, whatever. Every section should be serving a purpose, every subsection, and at the end of the day, every paragraph. And as I said to my class just last week in our last lecture, I said, actually, the best authors who write novels will tell you that every sentence is serving a purpose. Every word is chosen for the purpose that it serves. So, for example, if you were to have a section 2.1, the consequences of poverty for the education of girls, you would say to yourself, you'd write down, the purpose of this section is to establish the premises by identifying the major consequences of poverty for the education of girls. To that end, its content is therefore constituted by a review of etc., etc. So that then gives you the structure which helps your content to be driven by purpose. As I've said there, it'll help you to manage and control the whole project and keep your writing tightly focused. Obviously, it's going to change as things change in the wash. That's fine. There's an important note in the second half of that slide. These statements of purpose and content are not included in this explicit format in the final paper, but they can be rewritten more subtly and used as signposts to guide your reader through the final text, especially if it's a big piece like a dissertation. Now, you might not have come across this word signposting in writing, but we use it all the time. So you might, for example, finish a chapter by saying, in this chapter, we have done this. Now, in the next chapter, I'm going to do that. And then you start the next chapter, more or less with the same kind of sentence. In the last chapter, I did this, and in this chapter, I'm going to do that. Those are signposts for your reader to guide them through. And you'll see me using signposts when the content of my proposal gets philosophically a bit denser. In terms of structure, there's a few things I want to point out here. One is that it needs to be clear to your reader that you've actually written with a definite purpose in mind, in accordance with a structure. Have you used subheadings? Are you presenting your ideas in a natural order? And the way to check that is to do what is superhuman for most of us, finish 2 weeks before your deadline, so that you can put your paper on ice and come back and read it cold from the perspective of a first-time reader. I don't think I've ever achieved that, but we try. Mostly I miss deadlines, like lots of us, I'm sure. Have you linked your paragraphs in a natural order? Scrutinize your draft metacognitively. What point am I making here? Why? So what point should come next? As you know from school level writing, are you starting with a topic sentence in each paragraph? Of course, you don't have to, but these are simple guidelines. But I think what's important here, does each paragraph deal with one issue and expand with explanations, illustrations, arguments, counter arguments, and so on. Don't want to spend too much time here. I want to get on to the text of my proposal. And that's the title. It's called Hong Kong Torn Asunder, Values, Ethics, and Education Out of the Impasse. That will probably not be the title of the book that comes out of it. I don't know yet, but at least that was the title of the proposal. Now, the way I've designed this PowerPoint from here on is to have the text of my proposal in blue and the point that I want to make in red at the bottom. So the notes there to see are, you will notice that I've chosen a topical and important problem. This was obviously a good time to write something about this with a heading like that. So I guess I stood a better chance applying in the year that I did last year for this prestigious fellowship. So here's the initial abstract, and I am going to read some of this briefly to you. Your concern here is not with the content of my proposal. I know that you may find this, sorry, some of you may find it very boring, some of you may find it very interesting if you have some interest in ethics and social theory. So then you may find the content interesting. But remember that our focus here is not so much the content of what I'm saying here, it's how I'm saying it, it's how it's written. So like many grant proposals for which we submit, it starts with something like project objectives. And I had to set that out. And it's kind of similarly structured to an abstract, but not exactly the same way as the rubric I suggested a few slides back, because I've got to do it within the framework that the RGC requires. But the notes at the bottom simply indicate, look what I've done here. I've identified the problem. I've identified the question which comes out of that, my aims and objectives, and the method I'm going to be using. So you can see I've stated the problem. Hong Kong has been left, sort of torn apart from itself. I've said, look, I think that the roots of this impasse lie in a clash of values, the liberal autonomy associated with Western democracies against a strongly interpreted communitarian ethos, typical of Confucian heritage cultures. So my principal objective, I say at the bottom, is to answer the question how this clash of values might be reconciled. First, by doing that, and that. Okay, so you can see that I've identified the problem, the question, aims and objectives, and the method. Straight away here, you'll see first person. And in my notes at the bottom, I've said then notice how I'm using the first person. Notice how I'm showing the relevance of my earlier work to the proposal. This is meant to be a high-level grant given to people who've been around a while and are building on their earlier research and so on. So if it goes ECS onto GRF, then I suppose it goes to prestigious fellowship on top of that. So you're meant to show that you're building on stuff that you've been publishing and researching for a long time. Notice that I'm keeping my sentences relatively short. Now, I'm not saying overly simply so, and I made this joke with my doctoral class the other day when I said it's not a case of John opened the front door, John went outside, John walked down the path. It's not that overly simple. But I have been accused earlier in my career of writing terribly overly long sentences. And my old colleague and friend at the University of Hong Kong, Mark Bray, also used to accuse me of that quite a lot. So I've tried to not have sentences which are more than a couple of clauses long. And I've often tried to avoid using what are called periodic sentences, where the main clause comes at the end. This is a skill that I'm sure those of us who are teachers have picked up from how we teach in a classroom. If you teach by using periodic sentences, let me stop there and give you an example. If you start a sentence by saying, however, this, given that, although this, then the main clause, your students don't know what you're talking about through the subordinate clauses that precede the main clause. So start with the main clause and then work through subordinate clauses, etc. Because then at least your students know where you are. So I've minimized, and that's called a periodic sentence where the main clause comes at the end. So I've minimized my use of that and tried to guide the reader through with shorter sentences at the beginning, so that they're not dumped right in. Reading dense abstracts is hard for any editor. They come across your desk with great speed, and you're trying to appropriate a lot of new information quickly, and reviewers are doing the same thing. So be gentle with them, walk them into it slowly and easily. Don't patronize them. I'll make that point later, but structure very, very carefully. I don't Yeah, I don't think I want to read that. You've probably cast your eye down it while I've been talking. Okay. Here's the next. These paragraphs so far follow each other exactly. I've not left anything out. What I want to point to here is, please note, one paragraph, one idea. That sentences come in a natural order, keeping sentences fairly short. And then I'm going to highlight just one sentence, which has a tiny, tiny point in it, which I want to make. I'm going to read that sentence. It says, in the final section of this project, I pay attention to how educational change might best be initiated and sustained by drawing on my earlier work in complexity theory. If I recall, when I first wrote that, I don't think I had that comma after sustained. And if you take away the comma, the sentence can become ambiguous. In the final section, I pay attention to how educational change might best be initiated and sustained by drawing on. In other words, I may be talking about how we can initiate and sustain change by hiring more teachers, by firing more teachers, by paying teachers more, whatever. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about my how I'm paying attention to this by drawing on my earlier work. So that simple comma there, I think when I wrote this, I picked up afterwards, hang on, you need to slow the reader down there so that they don't think that this by drawing on is part of that immediate section that precedes it, but actually is a new idea. Sorry, I hope I've made that clear. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving. I then set out the significance, and then I provide, before going to the next section, the objectives in very clear summary. So I'm going to read that to answer the question how the clash of values between Hong Kong's young people and the government in both Hong Kong and Beijing might be reconciled. First, by defending a principle-based ethics, and second, by setting out how cross-cultural differences in values might be resolved by recourse to transcultural values and educational ideals, and to show how these ethics might be embedded in education in Hong Kong through a consideration of three issues: education and culture, education for reason and rationality, and educational change in the context of complexity. So there's a very clear summary of what I hope I've achieved in the first section of the proposal before moving on. Here is a spirally expanded paragraph. So what you read at the beginning, those sentences are in here, but now in the second section, the background of research, I've taken that same paragraph and expanded it spirally. I'm not moving in a linear direction yet. I'm not taking the reader into something new. So here I'm just giving more what ethnographers called a thick description, if you like, although it's hardly thick description. I'm just painting the picture a little bit more fully. So I'll read that. Hong Kong has been left following months of clashes over the nature of its relationship with mainland China, divided from itself and torn asunder, socially, culturally, and politically, from the country of which it is ultimately an integral part. The SAR is at an impasse. Never before have the people of Hong Kong seen themselves as so separate from China. That's Loy Tai Lok. That sentence was not in the earlier part. So this is just painting the picture a little more fully. This at the same time as the political relationship between Beijing and Hong Kong is closer than ever. In an article entitled Protests and Pandemic, Will Pent-Up Resentment, Frustration Among Hong Kong's Youth Explode Again into Social Unrest? From the South China Morning Post of January last year. That article reports that Hong Kong is sitting on a powder keg, its young people and university students seething with rage. The article reports on a survey by 2 universities in Hong Kong that found that nearly 90% of students had no confidence in the government, describing their simmering grievances as a powder keg waiting to go off. None of this was in the initial paragraph. This just fills in again in a spiral expansion before moving on to anything new, what it looks like with more color, if you like. Researchers from the University of Hong Kong and the Chinese University of Hong Kong say that we seem to have accumulated a lot of gunpowder, but we've not tried to defuse the bomb yet. Maybe it will only take a spark to cause another big explosion. Public intellectuals in Hong Kong, this is Anthony Cheung and Loy Tai Lok. Anthony Cheung, our former president, are calling for dialogue for a reconstituted public and personal ethics to find a way out. Now that should surely help to convince a reviewer that this is a fairly urgent and important problem. But my point in this paragraph is again, I'm not moving into any new theory yet. The background of the research builds on that first section simply by expanding and painting the picture a little more fully. Now I can move into a linear progression. Slowly and carefully, don't lose your reader, and notice how I'm using first names of authors when I cite them for the first time. Most journals generally think that you must say just Taylor or Bauman or Giddens. These are 3 giants in the field of social theory, and I want my reviewer to know it's not just any Taylor I'm talking about, it's Charles Taylor. When they see Bauman, they should know it's Zygmunt Bauman. When they see Giddens, they should know it's Anthony Giddens. But nevertheless, because Taylor's a common surname, and because it just makes things that little bit more personal, I think, along with the use of the first person, as I mentioned earlier. I think the first time you introduce people who you're depending on, who you're quoting, citing, I like to use their first names as well. After that, it becomes Taylor, Bauman, Giddens, and so on. So here I'm moving linearly into new ground, but watch how I go carefully here. So I say that this is a periodic sentence in that there is a subordinate clause coming before the main clause. Forgive me. By way of providing a wider context to these issues in Hong Kong, I consider in the early sections of the project some key questions about the contemporary nature of moral comportment, and more specifically, questions about how moral responsibility is easily diminished in late modern society. Notice that that's a signposting sentence. I'm actually telling the reader what I'm going to do. Now I expand on this notion of diminished moral responsibility. As observed by Charles Taylor, Zygmunt Bauman, is associated with a contemporary sense of individual identity that is increasingly transient, fragile, and fragmented. What does that mean? Well, Anthony Giddens speaks of identity as disembedded, as a principal consequence of late modernity. Taylor describes an increasingly individualist outlook on the world, characterized by a minimal sense of moral responsibility to others. Even those of you who are here who have no background in contemporary social theory will, I'm sure, have understood that. Bauman characterizes, I can't read that because it's behind my screen share, in terms of 4 key, he characterizes, I think, the moral condition, the contemporary moral condition, in terms of 4 key moral issues. Now I'm going to go through all 4 of these moral issues which Bauman identifies, because I want to show you how I've written them. And you might find this interesting anyway, even though this is not a seminar in contemporary social theory and ethics. Again, I'm using one idea and one paragraph, but now I'm going to ask you this question: should I have done this inductively rather than deductively? Because notice what I'm doing. I'm first stating the argument, and then I'm giving an example. If I'd given you the example first, and then the principle, the argument, that would have been inductive. So I'm saying, okay, first he argues that our actions have consequences and ramifications well beyond what we're able to foresee, because of the complexity of a world made up of infinitely many social interactions. And if that's a little confusing, here's an immediate example. Who could have foreseen that one case of zoonotic viral transmission in Wuhan, if that is indeed what happened and where it happened, would have the catastrophic global consequences that it has in the past year? I should say 2 years by now, or is it 3? It is impossible, therefore, to set down ethical rules to guide actions whose consequences we cannot fully anticipate. Although I make the right point there, in this case, a global prohibition against the trade in wild animals might be a good place to start. But my point there is that from a writing perspective, after I've set down Bauman's first point, I'm giving an example with which we're all familiar to help understand that. Here again, second, says Bauman, given the substantial division of labor characteristic of the nature of contemporary work in a society dominated by huge corporations with all its associated technical complexity, periodic sentence, we are frequently reduced to being just bit players in the production of outcomes. What did I mean there? Well, because we're not sole authors of these outcomes, we construct ourselves as not responsible for their consequences. So when 2 Boeing 787 MAX aircraft crash shortly after each other, with the loss of everyone on board, with black box data indicating that both pilots faced similar challenges in keeping their planes up, who exactly is responsible for these fledgling technical problems and possible shortcuts to profit? There's an example with which every one of us is familiar. And notice my point at the bottom. I'm using substantial, non-trivial, and familiar examples. Third, and notice what I say at the bottom there. By now it's getting a little dense. So what am I going to do next? But let's just read this. Third, our lives in late modern society, argues Bauman, are typically constituted by the temporary occupation of many different roles, each an important aspect of who we are as individuals, but none of such overriding importance that it alone defines our identity. Someone might be an assembly line worker, a divorcee, a father of adult children, a member of a men's social club, a keen football fan, and a police reservist who carries a weapon when he's called to. Now, which of those 6 identities, those constituent parts of his identity, defines who he is? If none of those in particular, he will not easily take responsibility for the consequences of his occupation of any one of these roles, which he occupies so temporarily as to not make it meaningfully constitutive of who he is. And so the point that Bauman makes is that there is no readily consistent moral responsibility that suffuses all of his actions. And the argument, the example I often use when I teach this, if it's a philosophy of education ethics class, is to think of a football hooligan. This guy could be a football hooligan, but he could go and smash a few people up in a bar after the Champions League final in Paris on Saturday night, and he could knock somebody unconscious, and what the heck, on on Monday morning, I'll be back in Liverpool and I'll be an assembly line worker and a father, etc., etc. So what happened on the weekend in Paris stays in Paris. And that's really not part of who I am. So that sense of moral responsibility doesn't suffuse all of his actions. But that could be a little dense for a reader. So what do I do now? I'm going to summarize those first 3 points before moving to the fourth one. The combination of these first 3 moral characteristics of life in late modern society shows just how easily we evade moral responsibility. And now I'm summarizing. The first, because we'll never know the consequences of our actions for everyone anyway. The second, because we're only bit players in the production of outcomes far beyond our individual inputs. And third, it's only because it's only one aspect of who we are, which is that bit player after all. So there's a very, very small line of continuity between an action that we may be part of as part of who we are and its outcomes. Now that gets a little dense. Sorry, those 3 points get a little dense, but that summary now, I hope, might make it easier before going to the fourth. And what I want to highlight here is, I know this is dense, and so in red there, I've addressed the reader directly to help him or her when there's a bit of a conceptual leap. So reading. And fourth, should we, in spite of the above, be troubled by some moral discomfort, we no longer have an uncontested source of moral authority or meaning to which we might turn for guidance. What does that mean? Any such source. Think, for example, of the role played by religiously based ethics in traditional societies. So the source of moral authority might be Allah if you're Muslim, might be a Christian God if you're Christian, etc., etc. But the point that Taylor, Giddens, Bauman are all making is that any such source has been undermined by some of modernity's most consequential features for individuals, the disembedding of the self from traditional communities. So I don't need to read further, but my point in including that paragraph was to show you that sometimes if it's getting dense, address the reader directly. It's less formal, I know, but at least you're helping your reader to stay with you. I wanted to say earlier when I was talking about editing journals, editing book series, and so on. You know what you're often doing, any review that you're doing, you're often trying to identify how intellectually strong is the person who's applying to you, whether for money, whether to publish his or her article, whether to publish his or her book, whether to take them on as a PhD student. You're actually trying to get inside their head to see what they've got inside there. And so you're actually wanting to see how they manage argumentation. So I can't stress enough how important it is to keep the reader with you. You can easily overwhelm them with too much theory that they're not that familiar with. No journal editor, no reviewer, etc., knows everything in his or her field. We all know that. We all do the best we can with what gets put in front of us to review. I often get things from our research office here on campus. They ask me to review this grant proposal, and I say, look, I'm not an expert in this field, but I'll do the best I can. And if I'm reviewing for a journal and there's a section of the paper that I am not at home in, I will say to the editor, I don't have enough knowledge of this area. You need to find somebody else who is good in this area to review that. So you don't want to overwhelm your reader with a whole lot of dense stuff. A quick anecdote, long time ago, I used to teach at the University of Cape Town before I moved to Hong Kong. And I actually applied at the University of Durham. in the UK. They flew me over for an interview. I had to give a seminar presentation to their staff in the School of Education. Liz Jackson will know that Richard Smith was at Durham at the time, and he was editing the Journal of Philosophy of Education. Now, the Journal of Philosophy of Education in our field has a 93% rejection rate. Getting published in there is very hard. And I knew that this editor was going to be in the room when I gave my seminar. So I packed it with as much philosophical density as I could. Nobody understood what I was talking about, and I didn't get the job. But that's why I'm here in Hong Kong. So don't try to dazzle your reader with too much theoretical density. Keep them with you, again, using these inductive tricks, etc., which I'm pointing out. I want to raise a point here now. Bauman is if not the leading theorist of moral comportment in late modern society. This is what he refers to in his book as the postmodern moral crisis. This is the wider axiological context in which to begin to understand the challenges of values and ethics facing Hong Kong's young people today. As you know, we always say to our students, when you introduce a new term, define it. If your reader is not familiar with it, define how, explain, illustrate in some way, make sure you bring your reader with you by defining it. So here's my question. Should I have defined axiological? Because I know that 90% of you in the seminar today haven't ever used the word before. Probably only Liz and Steve have used the word before. It's simply, but I'm not going to define it because who's this written for? It's written for a reviewer who's meant to be pretty much in my field. The RGC is able to look all over the world for reviewers for this, so they should be able to find somebody with some background in philosophy, contemporary social theory. So they will know what axiological means. It's that branch of philosophy which deals with values and ethics. So when I say this is the axiological context, it's not, for example, the epistemological context. It doesn't have to do with the theory of knowledge. It has to do with values and ethics. But I'm not going to patronize my reader by explaining axiological. And I know that my reader either has an Oxford English dictionary on his or her desk, which is not the case, but they've got Google right in front of them. So they can quickly Google the meaning of axiological if they don't know it. But I deliberately didn't explain that because that could be taken as patronizing. Okay, next paragraph. Having established this context, my first step in this project is to. So that's been a philosophically dense section. So now I'm using very clear signposting after this to take them back to objective one. So I make no apologies there for using clear signposting. Okay, here I've skipped some paragraphs and I'm throwing you into some very difficult philosophical stuff. Okay, what am I doing? I've highlighted in red the signposting that I'm using to guide the reader through this philosophical stuff, because likely they don't know this. It's not likely that the reviewer, they will know Immanuel Kant probably, but they're not going to know W.D. Ross, and they probably won't know Levinas. So what I'm doing is each step, I'm saying, I will show by reference to the moral intuitionist W.D. Ross in red. To get there, I argue that. Next sentence, this Bauman finds in. Next sentence, for Levinas and Bauman. Next paragraph, I turn then to Ross, who argues that. So I'm showing very, very clearly with very careful signposting the move step by step from Immanuel Kant to W.D. Ross, to Bauman, to Levinas, and then back to Ross. And I show what I'm doing. This is Greek to most of you and very boring, I'm sure. But the point is, how am I writing something that even my reviewer is probably not going to be familiar with? I think the only person in this room, in this virtual room, is Liz, who's going to be familiar with that, and probably Steve. Okay, second question here, the underlined bit there, deontological ethics. Should I have defined that? And my answer here is no, because I expect that anybody with a background in ethics knows what deontology is. But if I'm teaching this to first-year students, which I actually have done on this campus in our general education course, 500 students at a time, some of you have heard me give that lecture, I do teach deontological ethics. And there I do explain very carefully what it is. But I'm not going to do it here because it's bread and butter for the reviewer who should be reading this. When I write this as a book, of course, which I'm doing right now and have been doing for the past 6 months, when I write this as a book, it obviously is important that I do define deontological ethics, because the book is meant for a more public audience. But in the proposal, no, I'm not going to patronize my reader by doing that. Again, I simply want to stress, not by reading this, I simply want to stress how careful the signposting is as it remains philosophically dense. And I want to point out to you how much easier it is when you use the first person. So in red, in the paragraphs up there, but that is where my characterization of Ross's ethics as intuitionist deontology will lie. So I'm showing the reader that's where I'm going to find it. And then how I will show Bauman's editor. I will then argue that. And then the next paragraph, as the first objective of this project, what will be the purpose of this careful derivation? It is because. So I'm showing the reader every move that I want to make, because I'm aware that this is philosophically dense and possibly dealing with authors that my reviewer doesn't know. I've already talked to you about the debate about first versus third person. Frankly, I think it's time for us all to give up using the third person in our claims to our attempts to be claiming objectivity, etc., and to be pure scientists. We are social scientists. We are in the humanities. I think we should all be using the first person, as I said earlier, particularly after the shifting zeitgeist, after the postmodern turn. Sorry, big word there. The shift in how we view the world after the postmodern turn, which has kind of taught us to be more critical of the claims to pure objectivity in the natural sciences. Can we just transplant that into the social sciences and humanities? Which we can't, of course, but that's a separate story. There are two counter arguments that I needed to deal with at this point, and I've included them here. Again, I've selected this excerpt because I want to stress how important it is to deal with counter arguments fairly and honestly. So don't construct your opponent as a straw man. The straw man is a metaphor from a scarecrow in the middle of a field, chasing the birds away. It's not a real human being. It's a person. It's a scarecrow wearing a jacket stuffed with straw. So when you deal with a potential counter argument, represent your opponent fairly and deal with them honestly and fairly. So to show you this, I've said here there are two important potential counter arguments which I should mention. The first is the argument that principles such as the rule of law and equal liberty before the law are local, specific to Western culture, and therefore have no transcultural normative reach and cannot accordingly be universal. You will remember that 2019 was all about protests against a mooted extradition law, which had to do with Hong Kong's fear that the rule of law would be damaged in this special administrative region. That's what triggered the whole thing off. And I'm going to deal with this debate, and somebody might say to me, the rule of law, Western concept, nonsense. It's not a universal at all. And how am I, and it has no transcultural normative reach, can't be universal. So how can I argue against that? So I need to alert my reader to the fact that I'm aware of those counter arguments, and I will in fact deal with them. The second counter argument is associated with Richard Rorty. That's something called the God's Eye view. I'm not going to go into that now, but the point I'm making is that I think that you strengthen your credibility before your reader, before your reviewer, if you deal honestly, if you open up the counter arguments and deal with them before they fire at you. So I think it's a very good way to convince reviewers of your genuineness, your sincere desire to put something decent on the table that has dealt with potential counter arguments and so on. Okay, I just have 3 more slides and then I'll stop. Now we move down to objective 2. My final objective is to show how these ethics might be embedded in education in Hong Kong. This depends on 3 aspects of my earlier work: A, in education and culture; B, in education for reason and rationality; and C, educational change in the context of complexity. 2 points that I want to make there. It's a new section, so I'm going slowly and carefully and using short sentences and signposting. And again, because it's for a prestigious fellowship application, but I think any GRF should do the same. ECS, it's a little more difficult, an early career scheme, but at least if it's a GRF proposal, you want to build the confidence of your reviewer by building your proposal on your earlier published work. So I make it very clear how I'm building on my earlier stuff in this proposal. The point I want to make from this paragraph, and it's my second last point, is that you need to be sensitive also to the cultural context in which you're writing. I hope we all are. Those of us who've been teaching in Hong Kong for a while will know that critical thinking is actually a bit of a dirty word in that it translates badly into Chinese with strongly negative connotations. I actually indicated this early, but I didn't want to talk about it then. I thought I would talk about it now. And I say, look, it doesn't have to be like that. I'm going to argue in red there that critical thinking is associated not with negativity, but with rationality. And there I draw on Harvey Siegel. It's about being moved by reasons, to believe and to act on the basis of reasons. That's what critical thinking is. It's not negative thinking. So I need to make that clear because I'm working here in Greater China. Lots of my readers are going to have that cultural background. In the West, whatever the West is, certainly critical thinking has a more positive connotation than it does here. Okay, and this is my last slide, I think. Sorry, one more slide. My objective here is to show how positive changes in education in Hong Kong might be initiated and sustained. And that gets fairly philosophically dense again, talking about concepts in complexity theory, something called inertial momentum that comes from physics, stuff from economics, increasing returns, decreasing returns, etc. The point I simply want to make there is clarify, clarify, clarify. And I get that from an author called Anthony Weston, who I really love. I ask all my students to read his book on clear thinking, reading, and writing. Clarify, clarify, clarify at every turn. I don't want to go into that paragraph, but that's kind of what I'm focusing on doing there. And then the last section of the research proposal, and this is my last slide, asks you to list just 5 publications. You're only allowed to list 5. So I chose 5, each of which is fitted into one of the 5 objectives. So you might remember I had objective 1A and B and 2A, B, and C. So I've taken just one publication and slotted it in under each of those 5 objectives. And I've said at the bottom there, since you can list only 5, show if they have been reprinted anywhere, republished, if they've been translated, show that, etc. It all just helps to build the confidence of your reviewer. And I'm pretty sure that now that we're on to your publications, I'm done. Yeah. Sorry, that was a bit longer than I thought, but Tina, thank you. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Mark. Now we move into the Q&A section. The floor is open. Questions and comments are welcome. So you can unmute yourself and speak out, or either type your questions into the chat box, please.